Something unprecedented is happening to American democracy right now. And most people aren't paying attention, while we're all caught up in the daily news cycle, the rules that govern how we vote. Who gets to vote, and whose votes actually matter are being rewritten in real time. And here's what makes this different from anything we've seen before. It's happening a full year before the 2026 midterm elections, in ways that have no parallel in modern American history. Last Tuesday, California voters did something extraordinary. They approved Proposition 50 by an overwhelming 64% margin, a measure that openly declares itself as retaliation against what's happening in Republican-controlled states. The ballot language didn't hide behind polite political language. It literally called itself the Election Rigging Response Act. Think about that for a moment. We've reached a point where voters in America's largest state are being asked to approve gerrymandering explicitly as a defensive weapon in a redistricting war. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. From Texas to North Carolina, from Missouri to Ohio, from the Supreme Court chambers to state legislatures across the country. The entire architecture of American elections is being dismantled and rebuilt before our eyes. So today we need to understand exactly what's being changed, why it's happening now, and what it means for the future of American democracy. I've followed American politics for decades, and I've seen my share of partisan battles. I've watched Democrats and Republicans fight over policies, budgets, judicial appointments, you name it. But what's happening right now is fundamentally different. This isn't about policy anymore. This is about power in its rawest form. It's about who gets to decide the rules before the game even begins. And here's what troubles me most. Both sides seem to have accepted that we're no longer playing by the old norms. When California's Governor Gavin Newsom proposed redrawing his state's congressional map, he didn't pretend it was about fair representation or responding to demographic changes. He said it openly. We're doing this because Texas did it first, and if we don't fight fire with fire, we'll get burned. That honesty is almost refreshing, but it's also terrifying. Because once you abandon the pretense that redistricting should be fair and nonpartisan, once you openly embrace it as a weapon, there's no going back. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. To understand what's really happening, we need to look at three separate but interconnected battles, are all converging on the 2026 midterms. Think of them as three different ways to rewire the election system, each powerful on its own but potentially devastating in combination. In August of this year, something broke. Texas, under pressure from President Trump, became the first state to redraw its congressional districts in the middle of the decade, something that traditionally only happens after the census every 10 years. The new map was designed with one goal: flip 5 Democratic seats to Republican control. Now you might think, well, that's just Texas being Texas, but here's why it matters. Texas Republicans already controlled 67% of the state's congressional seats, despite only winning 52% of the popular vote. That's gerrymandering, sure, but it was gerrymandering from 2021, following the normal census cycle. This new manipulation pushes their control to potentially 80% of seats. They're not just tilting the playing field, they're building a mountain where there used to be a hill. Trump's reasoning was brutally pragmatic. Republicans currently hold the House by just a handful of seats. Losing control in 2026 would mean House Democrats could investigate his administration, potentially begin impeachment proceedings, and block his legislative agenda. So he went state by state, pressuring Republican governors and legislatures to redraw maps now, while they still have the power to do so. Missouri followed, then North Carolina, then Ohio. Each state found legal justifications for why mid-decade redistricting was suddenly necessary. Missouri could gain 1 seat for Republicans, North Carolina, 1 more, Ohio, potentially 2 additional seats. Add it all up, and we're looking at roughly 9 to 10 congressional seats flipping to Republican control before a single vote is cast in 2026. But then California struck back. Proposition 50 creates the potential for Democrats to gain 5 seats, Virginia is considering similar measures, and suddenly we're in a national redistricting arms race with no clear end in sight. Political scientists are calling this unprecedented. One expert told the New York Times, "The wheels are coming off the car right now. Because once you establish that redistricting can happen any time, for any political reason, you've removed one of the last stabilizing elements in American democracy." While the redistricting battle plays out in state legislatures, a parallel fight is happening over the most basic question in democracy: who gets to vote, and how? In March, President Trump signed an executive order titled, "Preserving and Protecting the Integrity of Elections." Despite the bland bureaucratic language, this order represents a radical shift in how American elections could operate. The centerpiece is a requirement that every voter must provide documentary proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote, not just any ID, but specific documents. A passport, a real ID-compliant driver's license that indicates citizenship, or a birth certificate. The House of Representatives has already passed legislation called the SAVE Act that would codify these requirements into federal law. Now, on the surface, this might sound reasonable after all. Shouldn't citizens be the ones voting in American elections? That's already the law. Voting as a non-citizen is a federal crime punishable by imprisonment and deportation. But here's where it gets complicated. Approximately 146 million Americans don't have a passport. Many people, particularly older voters, women who changed their names when they married, and low-income Americans, don't have easy access to birth certificates. Richard Hasen, an election law expert at UCLA, estimates that these new requirements could prevent millions of eligible citizens from registering to vote. Think about a woman who got married 40 years ago and took her husband's name. Her birth certificate shows her maiden name. Her current ID shows her married name. Under the new requirements, that discrepancy could disqualify her from registering unless she can obtain additional documentation proving the name change for someone living paycheck to paycheck. Taking time off work and paying fees to get that documentation might be impossible. The order also requires the Department of Homeland Security to share data with state officials to identify non-citizens on voter rolls. It empowers the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk, to examine state voter registration lists and issue subpoenas if necessary. Critics worry this creates a federal surveillance apparatus over state elections that could be used to intimidate voters and cast doubt on election results. Several states, including California and Arizona, have already filed lawsuits challenging the executive order. Arizona Secretary of State, Adrian Fontes, called it an attempt to federalize elections and warned that it might be designed to create a pretext for canceling the election later, whether that's hyperbole or legitimate concern. The fact that a state election official is even raising that possibility tells you how far trust has deteriorated. The third battlefront is about the mechanics of voting itself. In August, President Trump pledged to issue an executive order eliminating mail-in ballots and voting machines ahead of the 2026 midterms. On social media, he wrote, "I'm going to lead a movement to eliminate mail-in ballots. And while we're at it, highly inaccurate, expensive, and seriously controversial voting machines. This matters because of who uses mail-in ballots. Data consistently shows that Democratic voters are more likely to vote by mail than Republicans during the 2020 election. Mail-in ballots became a major point of contention, with Trump repeatedly claiming without evidence that they were prone to fraud. Now, the constitutional authority for a president to ban mail-in ballots is highly questionable. Elections are run by states, not the federal government. But the fact that Trump is openly stating this goal puts pressure on Republican-controlled states to restrict mail-in voting on their own. And it's already happening. Multiple states are considering legislation to eliminate or severely restrict mail-in voting. The Supreme Court just agreed to hear a case about Mississippi's policy of counting mail-in ballots that arrive up to 5 business days after Election Day, as long as they were postmarked by Election Day. The Republican National Committee is challenging this, arguing that Election Day means ballots must be received on that day, not just mailed by then. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the RNC, it could invalidate mail-in ballot grace periods in dozens of states, potentially disenfranchising military voters overseas, Americans living abroad, and voters in rural areas, where mail service is slow. Now, some of you might be thinking, politics has always been rough. Gerrymandering has always existed. What makes this different? Fair question. Let me give you some historical perspective. The term gerrymandering dates back to 1812, when Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry signed a redistricting bill that created a district shaped like a salamander. So yes, politicians have been manipulating district lines for over 200 years. But there was always an understanding, an unwritten rule, that redistricting happened after the census every 10 years. It was predictable. Both parties knew when it would happen and could plan accordingly. It was like knowing that football season happens in the fall. You might not like the rules, but at least you know when the game is played. What's happening now is like deciding to change the rules in the middle of the season because your team is losing, and once one side does it, the other side has no choice but to respond in kind. That's exactly what political scientists call a race to the bottom. Each escalation by one side justifies an escalation by the other, and suddenly there are no rules anymore, just raw power. We saw something similar in the 1960s and 1970s with the breakdown of congressional norms. For decades, the Senate operated on the principle that you needed 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, but judicial appointments and legislation could still pass with bipartisan cooperation. Then both parties started using the filibuster more aggressively. Democrats eliminated it for most judicial appointments in 2013. Republicans eliminated it for Supreme Court appointments in 2017. Now the filibuster has become a weapon of obstruction rather than a tool for deliberation. What we're watching in 2025 is that same dynamic playing out with election systems themselves. Once you break the norm that redistricting happens on a predictable schedule, once you break the norm that election rules should be stable and nonpartisan, you can't put that genie back in the bottle. History shows us that democracies don't usually die from military coups or sudden revolutions. They die slowly through a process called democratic backsliding. It happens when political leaders chip away at democratic institutions bit by bit, always with justifications that sound reasonable in isolation. Hungary is a perfect example. Viktor Orban didn't seize power through violence. He was democratically elected. Then he changed election laws to favor his party. He gerrymandered districts. He changed voting procedures. He took control of media outlets. Each change seemed small, but collectively they transformed Hungary from a democracy into what political scientists now call a competitive authoritarian regime. Elections still happen, but the ruling party has so many structural advantages that losing becomes nearly impossible. I'm not saying America is becoming Hungary, but I am saying that the warning signs we're seeing, this simultaneous assault on multiple aspects of election integrity, should concern everyone regardless of party affiliation. Why is all this happening now? Why the urgency? To understand that, we need to look at, actually at stake in the 2026 midterms. From Trump's perspective, maintaining Republican control of the House is existential. A Democratic House could launch investigations into his administration's policies, particularly around immigration enforcement, tariffs, and the use of executive power. They could potentially begin impeachment proceedings, something Trump has faced twice before. They could block his legislative agenda entirely. But there's also a specific economic issue in play right now. The Supreme Court is considering a major case about whether Trump exceeded his constitutional authority by imposing sweeping tariffs without explicit congressional approval. Market odds suggest there's a 75–80% chance the court rules against Trump. If that happens, the Treasury might have to refund hundreds of billions of dollars in tariffs already collected. That's not just an embarrassment. It's a potential fiscal crisis. Trump needs a compliant Congress to pass legislation that would retroactively authorize those tariffs, provide legal cover for his trade policies. If Democrats control the House, that legislation dies. His entire economic strategy of reshaping America's relationship with China and other trading partners collapses. From the Democratic perspective, they only need to flip 3 seats to regain control of the House. 3 seats in a normal election cycle. That would be very achievable, especially given that midterm elections typically favor the party that doesn't control the White House. But these are normal circumstances. If Republicans successfully gerrymander their way to an additional 9 or 10 seats before voting even begins, Democrats would need to win by a massive popular vote margin just to break even. That's why you're seeing Democrats abandon their traditional opposition to gerrymandering and fight fire with fire. They've done the math. Playing by the old rules when your opponent has abandoned them is just unilateral disarmament. There's another element to this that doesn't get enough attention. The role of data and technology in modern gerrymandering. When politicians drew district lines in the 1960s or 1980s, they worked with paper maps and rough demographic data. Gerrymandering was crude. You could create districts that favored your party, but you couldn't be surgical about it. Today, political operatives have access to voter data at an incredibly granular level. They know not just how districts voted in the last election, but how individual neighborhoods, streets, even houses voted. They can model out thousands of different district configurations and choose the one that maximizes their party's advantage while still appearing facially neutral. This is sometimes called cracking and packing. You crack your opponent, as voters, by spreading them across multiple districts, so they never have enough votes to win any district. You pack them by concentrating them in a few districts that they win overwhelmingly, wasting their votes. Modern technology makes this precise to an extent that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. The Department of Government Efficiency's involvement in reviewing voter rolls brings this technology to voter registration. As well, Elon Musk built his fortune on data analysis and AI. The concern among voting rights advocates is that these same technologies could be used to identify and purge voters under the guise of removing non-citizens, but with a partisan thumb on the scale. Let me share an analogy that might help clarify what's happening. Imagine you're playing a board game with friends. The rules say that at the end of each round, players can propose rule changes, but everyone has to agree. That system works as long as everyone acts in good faith. Now imagine one player decides to propose rule changes in the middle of the game. Changes that specifically benefit them. Other players object, pointing to the rules, but the aggressive player says, well, the rules don't explicitly prohibit mid-game changes, so I'm doing it. The other players now face a choice. They can stick to the old understanding and get crushed, or they can start proposing their own mid-game rule changes. Once they choose the second option, the game becomes chaos. Soon nobody knows what the rules are anymore. And everything depends on who has more raw power to force their preferred rules on everyone else. That's where American democracy is right now. We're in the chaos phase, where the old understandings have broken down, but new stable rules haven't emerged. Another way to think about it: democratic systems are like ecosystems. They're complex, with many interdependent parts. You can't just change one element without affecting everything else. When you break the norm around redistricting timing, it affects trust in elections. When trust in elections erodes, it affects voter turnout. When certain groups feel disenfranchised, it affects political stability. These effects cascade and amplify each other. So what happens next? What should we expect as we move toward the 2026 midterms? First, expect more states to join the redistricting fight. Indiana, Kansas, Florida, and Louisiana are all Republican-controlled states where mid-decade redistricting is being discussed. If they follow through, Republicans could gain another 4 to 5 seats on top of the 9 they've already secured through redistricting. On the Democratic side, Virginia is actively considering its own redistricting. If Democrats there succeed, it could partially offset Republican gains, but the GOP would still maintain an advantage. Second, expect the flood of lawsuits. Every one of these changes, from redistricting to voter ID requirements to mail-in ballot restrictions, will be challenged in court. The Supreme Court's docket for this term already includes several major, election-related cases. Their rulings will shape not just the 2026 midterms, but potentially the 2028 presidential election and beyond. Third, expect the Supreme Court case on Mississippi's mail-in ballot grace period to have ripple effects across the country. If the court rules that ballots must be received by Election Day, not just postmarked by then, it could create massive logistical challenges for election officials and potentially disenfranchise thousands of voters, particularly in rural areas and among military personnel stationed overseas. Fourth, expect continued pressure on state election officials from both federal authorities and political activists. These are the people who actually run elections. The county clerks and secretaries of state who certify results. They're already under enormous pressure. And it's only going to intensify. Here's what you can do, and why it matters. First, pay attention to local races. State legislatures and governorships control how elections are run. These down-ballot races that most people ignore are suddenly the most important elections in America. The National Democratic Redistricting Committee is focusing resources on state-level elections precisely because that's where the real power lies. Second, understand the specifics of what's happening in your state. Is your state considering redistricting? Are there new voter ID requirements? Have mail-in ballot rules changed? This information is available from your Secretary of State's website, but you have to look for it. Most people won't, which means they'll show up to vote in 2026 and discover the rules have changed. Third, recognize that this isn't just about Democrats versus Republicans. Right now, Republicans are pushing harder on redistricting and voting restrictions, but the precedents being set can be used by whoever holds power in the future. If you're a Republican who supports mid-decade redistricting when your party does it, remember that Democrats will do the same thing when they have the opportunity. The erosion of norms cuts both ways. Fourth, demand that your elected representatives take a stand on election integrity that goes beyond partisan advantage. Ask them directly. Do you support mid-decade redistricting? Do you think election rules should be changed a year before an election? Would you support these changes if the other party were doing them? Finally, and this is perhaps most important, prepare yourself psychologically for the fact that the 2026 election results might not clearly reflect the will of the voters. With all these structural changes stacking up, with redistricting giving one party a significant built-in advantage, with voter ID requirements potentially preventing eligible citizens from voting, with mail-in ballot restrictions affecting how people can cast their votes, the final seat count in Congress might have more to do with rules changes than with what voters actually want. That's not me being cynical or partisan. That's just math. When you change the rules this dramatically, you change the outcome. The question is whether we as a society are okay with that. I don't have easy answers. I don't have a magic solution that makes everyone happy. What I do know is that democracies require trust. Trust that elections are fair, that your vote counts, that the system isn't rigged against you. Every time that trust is damaged, it becomes harder to maintain the cooperative spirit that makes democracy possible. The 2026 midterms won't just determine control of Congress. They'll determine whether we can still have elections that both sides accept as legitimate. That's what's really being rewired right now. Not just the technical rules of how we vote, but our shared belief that American democracy is worth preserving. So watch closely, ask questions, demand answers. Because the choices we make in the next year will shape American democracy for decades to come.